The automatic doors of Seaside Regional Hospital slid open with a pneumatic hiss that seemed to swallow the salt-thick air of coastal North Carolina. It was the kind of sound Madison Thornton had learned to hate during her first deployment, mechanical, sterile, the opposite of everything human. She sat in her Honda Civic for the third time that morning, hands wrapped around the steering wheel like it might anchor her to something solid. Through the windshield, she watched the flow of people entering and leaving the hospital, nurses in colorful scrubs, chattering about their weekends, doctors with stethoscopes draped like medals, families clutching coffee cups and worry us in equal measure. Madison's hands were shaking. Not much, just a tremor in the fingers, a slight vibration that made the wedding ring on her right hand, her mother's, not her own, catch the early morning light. She'd worn it on that hand deliberately, a small barrier against questions she didn't want to answer. The tremor was getting worse. She closed her eyes and counted. 1, 2, 3, 4. Inhale through the nose. Hold. Exhale through the mouth. The way the therapist at the VA had taught her back when she'd still believed therapy might actually work. By the count of 7, the shaking had stopped. By the count of 10, she'd convinced herself it had never happened. Madison Thornton was 30 years old, held a nursing degree from the University of North Carolina, and had exactly 2 years of documented work experience at a small clinic in Ohio. Her application was clean. Her references were solid. Her background check would reveal nothing except a gap between high school and college that she'd attributed to finding herself. Nobody needed to know that she'd found herself in places with names she still couldn't say out loud without tasting dust. She grabbed her bag from the passenger seat, a plain black backpack chosen specifically because it didn't look tactical, and stepped out into the humid September morning. The walk to the employee entrance took exactly 43 seconds. She'd timed it yesterday during her orientation, along with the distance to every exit, the location of every stairwell, the blind spots in the security camera coverage. Old habits didn't die, they just learned to hide better. The HR office smelled like fresh printer paper and lavender air freshener, a combination that somehow made Madison's stomach tighten. Jennifer Walters sat behind a desk that was aggressively organized with color-coded folders and a nameplate that caught the fluorescent light at exactly the wrong angle. "Madison, good morning." Jennifer's smile was the kind that belonged in a corporate training video. Warm but practiced, genuine but slightly too bright. "Are you excited for your first day?" "Yes, ma'am," Madison said, and immediately regretted the formality. Civilians didn't say ma'am like that with the crisp respect of someone who'd been trained to acknowledge rank. Jennifer didn't seem to notice. She was already pulling out forms, sliding them across the desk with the efficiency of someone who'd onboarded hundreds of new employees. "Everything looks perfect here. License current, degree is verified. Your references from the clinic in Ohio were glowing." Jennifer flipped through the file, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against the paper. "Dr. Patterson said you were the most detail-oriented nurse she had ever worked with." Madison nodded. Dr. Patterson was real. The clinic was real. The 2 years she'd spent there learning to be invisible, learning to be normal. Those were real too. Everything before that was carefully blank. "So," Jennifer continued, leaning forward with the conspiratorial air of someone about to share a secret, "what brings you to Wilmington? It's not exactly a big city." Madison had rehearsed this answer. "Fresh start. I have family in the area." It wasn't entirely a lie. Her brother lived in Raleigh, 2 hours north. They hadn't spoken in 14 months, not since he'd asked her why she never smiled in photos anymore, and she'd told him to mind his own goddamn business. "Well, we're thrilled to have you." Jennifer pushed the final stack of papers forward. "Just signatures? Here, here, and here. Oh, and do you have any questions? Anything at all about the facility, the department procedures?" Madison had exactly one question, the same question that had been burning in her mind since she'd walked through the building yesterday. "Where's the nearest stairwell from the emergency department?" Jennifer blinked. Her smile flickered just for a second like a light bulb considering whether to burn out. "That's specific. Most people ask about parking or to where the cafeteria. I like to know my exits." Madison kept her voice level, casual, the way she'd practiced in the mirror. "In case of fire or emergency." "Oh, of course, safety first." Jennifer pulled out a hospital map, unfolding it across her desk. "East stairwell here, west stairwell there. Fire exits are marked in red. Emergency protocols are in your onboarding packet." Madison studied the map the way she'd once studied topographical layouts of villages that no longer existed. She traced routes with her eyes, calculating distances, identifying choke points, noting which corridors had windows and which were internal. It took her exactly 12 seconds to memorize the entire layout. "Perfect," she said, signing the final form with handwriting that was almost aggressively neat. Thank you. Jennifer collected the papers, slipping them back into the folder that would live in a filing cabinet, somewhere a sanitized version of Madison's life reduced to bureaucracy. You'll start in the emergency department today. Nurse Kowalski will be your preceptor. She's wonderful, been here 15 years, knows everything. I appreciate it. And Madison, Jennifer's voice softened, losing some of its corporate sheen. I hope you find what you're looking for here. Fresh starts are important. Madison managed something that might have passed for a smile. Yes, ma'am. The emergency department was exactly what she'd expected, controlled chaos wrapped in the veneer of efficiency. The nurses' station sat at the center like a command post surrounded by exam rooms that radiated outward like spokes on a wheel. The smell hit her first antiseptic and coffee and something metallic that never quite washed out of the air, no matter how good the ventilation system was. It smelled like every field hospital she'd ever worked in, minus the sand and the screaming. Patricia Kowalski stood at the station with her arms crossed, surveying the department the way a general might survey a battlefield. She was somewhere in her mid-40s, with steel gray hair pulled back so tight it looked painful, and eyes that had the particular quality of someone who'd seen every flavor of human suffering and learned to file it away efficiently. "You're Thornton," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am." Trish's eyebrow twitched. "Don't ma'am me. Makes me feel ancient. Call me Trish." "Yes, Trish." "Better." Trish handed her a badge on a lanyard, the plastic still warm from the laminator. "You worked ER before mine." Madison had prepared for this question too. "I floated between departments, done some ER coverage." It was technically true. She'd floated between aid stations in 3 different countries, covered emergencies that ranged from dehydration to traumatic amputations to holding pressure on wounds that wouldn't stop bleeding no matter how hard you pushed. Trish made a non-committal sound in the back of her throat, the kind that suggested she'd heard every variation of nursing experience and had developed a healthy skepticism toward all of them. "Fine, today you shadow me. You watch, you learn, you don't touch anything unless I explicitly tell you to. Clear. Crystal. Good. We're short-staffed, so your orientation is going to be real world. Try to keep up." The first patient was a fisherman with a hand laceration that had soaked through a towel that used to be white. He was mid-50s, weathered like driftwood, trying to crack jokes about how his wife was going to kill him for ruining another good towel. Madison took his vitals while Trish prepped the suture kit. Blood pressure cuff on inflate release, pulse ox clipped to his finger, temperature probe under his tongue. The rhythm of it was familiar muscle memory that predated her nursing license by nearly a decade. The fisherman watched her hands the way injured people always did, trying to read whether the person treating them knew what they were doing. "You done this before?" he asked, his voice tight with pain he was trying to hide. "Yes, sir." Trish glanced up from the instrument tray, catching the way Madison had already positioned herself at the optimal angle, how she'd laid out the gauze before being asked how her hands moved, with the kind of efficiency that only came from repetition under pressure. "How'd you know I needed that?" Trish asked quietly, nodding at the gauze. Madison didn't look up from cleaning the wound. "It's the next thing." The fisherman flinched when she irrigated the laceration. Madison adjusted her pressure immediately, fractionally, the way you learned to do when pain management mattered more than speed. When Trish asked for the suture kit, Madison had already opened it, instruments arranged in order of use. Later, after the fisherman had been discharged with instructions he probably wouldn't follow, and a prescription he definitely wouldn't fill, Trish cornered Madison at the supply closet. "Where did you really work before?" Madison kept her eyes on the inventory sheet she was pretending to review. "Mercy Clinic, Columbus, Ohio. And before that, nursing school." "Uh-huh." Trish's tone suggested she'd filed this conversation away under revisit later. "Well, whatever you did, you've got good hands. Just don't get cocky. This place will humble you faster than you can blink." By day 3, Madison had learned the geography of Seaside Regional, the way she'd once learned the layout of forward operating bases, exits, first choke points, second supply locations, third. She knew which hallway cameras had blind spots, 2 near radiology, 1 by the loading dock. She knew the security guard's patrol pattern every 45 minutes, stopping to flirt with the receptionist for exactly 3 minutes before continuing his rounds. She knew these things because her brain wouldn't let her not know them. At 2 in the morning during her first night shift, she walked the corridors and timed how long it took for the automatic doors to close after someone passed through. 2.3 seconds, long enough for someone to slip through behind you if they were fast enough. Not long enough to trigger the motion sensor twice. She hated that she knew this. Hated that her mind automatically cataloged tactical information in a place where the biggest threat was supposed to be budget cuts and patient satisfaction scores. Day 5 brought a Marine. Corporal Tyler Brennan was 22 years old with a dislocated shoulder from a training exercise that had gone sideways. He sat on the exam table with his back parade ground straight, despite the pain that made his jaw clench and his breathing shallow. Madison recognized the haircut before she saw the dog tags. High and tight, so fresh it looked like it had been cut that morning. His eyes tracked her movement into the room with the kind of awareness that civilians didn't have, the constant threat assessment that became second nature after your first deployment. "I'm Madison," she said, keeping her voice neutral and professional. "I'll be helping Dr. Brennan with your shoulder reduction." "Yes, ma'am." The formality was automatic, drilled in deep. She took his vitals, checked the neurovascular status of his hand color, good capillary refill, under 2 seconds, sensation intact. When she rotated his arm to assess the injury, he didn't flinch, but she felt the muscles tense under her fingers. "You're doing great," she said quietly. "We'll get you fixed up." His eyes met hers and something shifted in his expression. Recognition, but not of her specifically. Recognition of type. "You from around here?" he asked. "No, where'd you work before?" Madison's hands paused for exactly half a second, long enough that he noticed, short enough that most people wouldn't. "Clinic in Ohio." Tyler nodded slowly, but his gaze didn't waver. He was reading her the way she'd learned to read other people, looking for the tells that separated veterans from civilians. "You got good hands," he said finally, his voice dropping to something just above a whisper. "Steady. Like you've done this under pressure." Madison secured the sling around his arm with practiced efficiency. "Hold still while I adjust this." "Yes, ma'am." After he'd been discharged, Trish found Madison in the supply room organizing trauma kits with the kind of precision that bordered on obsessive. "That Marine," Trish said, leaning against the doorframe, "he asked me if you'd served." Madison's hands didn't stop moving. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I didn't know, because I don't." Trish's voice was careful, not accusing, but definitely curious. "Want to tell me?" "Nothing to tell." Madison closed the kit, checked the seal, placed it on the shelf in the exact position it was supposed to occupy. "I'm just a nurse." "Uh-huh." Trish pushed off the doorframe. "Well, just a nurse. You're scheduled for overnight shift on Friday. Try to get some sleep before then. It gets weird after midnight." Day 6 was when the cracks started to show. Madison was alone in the supply closet, restocking the crash cart with medications that had strict inventory controls. Epinephrine, atropine, amiodarone, the drugs that stood between someone and death when their heart forgot how to beat. Her hands started shaking. Not the small tremor she could hide. This was worse. This was the kind of shaking that made the vials rattle against each other, that made her breath come too fast and too shallow, that brought back the smell of copper and cordite and sand that got into everything no matter how many times you washed. Flashback hit her like a mortar round. Desert heat, the kind that made the air shimmer and turned metal too hot to touch. The aid station tent smelling like blood and iodine and fear. A Marine god he'd been so young, 19 maybe, with a sucking chest wound that sounded like drowning on dry land. She'd held pressure on his chest while the surgeon worked her hands slick with blood that wouldn't stop flowing. The kid had looked up at her with eyes that knew, that saw the future contracting down to nothing, and he'd asked her if it hurt to die. She'd told him no. She'd lied. Madison's back hit the supply closet wall. She slid down to the floor, pressing her palms flat against the cool linoleum. Counted. 1, 2, 3, 4. Breathe in, hold. Breathe out. Bottom 6, 7. By 10, the tremor had subsided. By 15, she could stand again. By 20, she'd convinced herself it hadn't happened. She finished restocking the cart with hands that were perfectly steady, checked her watch, and realized she'd lost 7 minutes to a past that was supposed to stay buried. Nobody had seen. The door to the supply closet had been closed. She was fine. Day 7 started with a sunrise, the color of blood on water. Madison sat in her car in the hospital parking lot, watching the sky lighten from black to gray to that particular shade of red that always made her think of warning signals. Her phone showed 3 missed calls from her brother and a text message she hadn't opened. She deleted the notification without reading it. At precisely 7:58, she walked through the employee entrance and clipped on her badge. The emergency department was already humming with the morning shift change nurses giving report to their counterparts with the efficient shorthand of people who spoke in acronyms and understood the difference between stable and stable for now. Trish caught her at the coffee station. "You pick up extra shifts if needed." "Yes." "Most new nurses bitch about overtime." "I don't mind." Trish studied her over the rim of her coffee cup, those sharp eyes cataloging details that Madison couldn't hide. The way she held herself too straight, like someone used to standing at attention. The way her eyes constantly scanned the room, tracking movement and assessing threats. The way she wore her scrubs like a uniform instead of just clothes. You ever get tired, Thornton? Of course. But you don't show it. Madison met her gaze. I just keep moving. There was weight in those three words, the kind that came from understanding that stopping meant thinking and thinking meant remembering, and remembering meant drowning in things that had happened in places that officially didn't exist. Trish seemed to hear it. Yeah, she said quietly. I know some people like that. At 2:15 that afternoon, Madison was at the VA hospital across town. She hadn't told anyone at Seaside Regional about the fact that twice a week on her days off, she volunteered at the understaffed, underfunded veterans hospital that smelled like institutional cleaning solution and broken promises. She was teaching a young medic how to pack a wound when she felt someone watching her. Garrett Sullivan stood in the doorway of the training room with his arms crossed and the kind of expression that suggested he'd been standing there for a while. He was 62 years old with silver hair, cut military short, and eyes that had seen things that left marks on the soul. Coffee, he said when she finished the demonstration. Madison hesitated. I should, not a request, Corman. The title hit her like a punch to the sternum. She looked at him sharply, but his expression was neutral, patient, the look of someone who could wait as long as it took for the truth to surface. They ended up in the parking lot sitting on the tailgate of his truck with terrible coffee from the vending machine steaming in their hands. The afternoon sun was starting to slant toward evening, turning the pavement golden. Where'd you serve? Doc Sullivan asked. Madison watched the steam rise from her coffee. Middle East, forward operating bases. How long? 4 years, 2 deployments. Why hide it? The question was simple. The answer wasn't. Because when people know, Madison said slowly, they see the uniform before they see the person. They see PTSD. They see liability. They see someone who might snap under pressure, who might have nightmares, who might be broken in ways that don't show up on x-rays. Doc nodded like he'd expected that answer. You're the furthest thing from broken kid. You don't know what I know enough. He took a sip of his coffee, made a face like he'd forgotten how terrible it was. And I know you're trying to disappear, but some skills don't let you disappear. They're in your bones. They come out when they're needed, whether you want them to or not. Madison's throat was tight. I just want to be a nurse. You'll never be just anything. Doc turned to look at her, and his eyes were kind but uncompromising. You're a corpsman. That doesn't wash off no matter how hard you scrub. When the moment comes, and it will come, don't hesitate. Do what you know how to do. He left her sitting there watching the sun sink lower, feeling the weight of words she couldn't argue against because they were true. Night shift started at 11:45. The emergency department had a different energy after midnight, quieter in some ways, louder in others. The usual daytime chaos of minor complaints and scheduled procedures gave way to the real emergencies, the things that couldn't wait until morning. Madison was restocking supplies in Trauma 1 when the radio crackled to life. Seaside Regional, this is County EMS. We have inbound trauma priority 1, ETAO in 4 minutes. Dr. Alexandra Brennan grabbed the radio. She was 32, brilliant, confident in the way that young doctors who'd never failed at anything tended to be. What's the situation? Military convoy incident on Highway 17. IED, 1 critical patient, multiple penetrating traumas. Blood pressures in the basement. Patient is traveling with armed military escort, and the paramedic paused and Madison could hear sirens in the background. A tactical dog. They're warning us the dog is aggressive. The room went still. IED. The acronym hung in the air like smoke. Improvised explosive device. The kind of thing that happened in places like Fallujah and Kandahar, not on highways in North Carolina. Madison's world narrowed to a pinpoint. The sounds of the emergency department became distant, muffled, like she was hearing them through water. Her vision tunneled. Her hands resting on the supply cart had started shaking again. Flashback. Not now, not here. But it came anyway, unbidden and unstoppable. The sound of an explosion close enough to feel in your chest. The smell of burning diesel and copper. Someone screaming for a medic. The weight of a rifle in her hands and a medical kit on her back, because in some places you needed both to stay alive long enough to save anyone. Thornton, Trish's voice cut through the memory. Madison blinked and the emergency department snapped back into focus. Her hands had gone still on the cart, pressed flat against the metal surface. You good? Trish asked, her eyes sharp with concern. Madison's mask slid back into place like a visor. Yes? You sure? You went white for a second there. I'm fine. The lie came easily practiced. Just surprised. IED in North Carolina doesn't make sense. Yeah, well, nothing makes sense after midnight. Trish turned back to the trauma bay, already moving into preparation mode. Let's get ready. If they're bringing military, this is going to be complicated. Madison followed her body, moving on autopilot, her mind racing through scenarios she'd sworn she'd left behind. IED meant blast pattern injuries, multiple traumas, penetrating wounds that could mask internal damage, pressure waves that did things to organs that didn't show up on the surface. And a tactical dog meant someone important, someone worth protecting, someone who might have enemies that didn't stop at hospital doors. At 11:51, the ambulance bay doors slammed open. Four Marines entered in tactical formation weapons, holstered but visible, moving with the kind of coordinated precision that turned a group of individuals into a single lethal unit. Between them on a gurney lay a man in dress uniform with ribbons across his chest and blood soaking through the fabric in places that suggested he was running out of time. At the foot of the gurney stood a Belgian Malinois. Atlas was 80 pounds of muscle and training, with eyes that tracked every movement in the room and a low growl that resonated in the chest cavity. He wasn't barking, didn't need to. The threat was clear in every line of his body, every tooth visible in his partially open mouth. Staff Sergeant Wyatt Bishop led the formation, his face carved from granite and urgency. We need immediate trauma intervention. Patient is Lieutenant General Nathaniel Blackwood. Multiple penetrating wounds from IED. He's been hypotensive for 15 minutes. Crashed twice en route. Dr. Brennan moved forward. Let's get him to... Atlas's head swung toward her. The growl deepened. Not a bark, but a warning that vibrated through the air like a threat written in sound. She stopped. The dog, Bishop said, his voice tight with frustration and fear, won't let anyone near the patient. General Blackwood is his handler. Without the handler giving commands, the dog is in protection mode. He's already bitten one doctor at the base hospital. The monitor above the gurney was screaming numbers that meant dying. Blood pressure 62/35, oxygen saturation 78%, heart rate 142 and climbing. Madison stood at the back of the room, pressed against the wall near the supply cabinets. Her heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. Her hands were shaking. Her breath was coming too fast. Every instinct she had was screaming at her to run, to hide, to protect herself from the moment that was coming, because she could feel it approaching like a wave that was going to drown her. But she'd made a promise once in a tent that smelled like blood and diesel to a kid with a sucking chest wound who'd asked if it hurt to die. She'd promised that she wouldn't let anyone die alone, wouldn't let anyone die if she could stop it. Doc Sullivan's words echoed in her head. When the moment comes, don't hesitate. Madison took a breath, let it out, took another. Then she stepped forward. A resident grabbed her arm. Don't, that dog will tear you apart. She pulled free without speaking, her eyes locked on Atlas. The dog's gaze swung to her, tracking her movement with the kind of intelligence that separated tactical animals from pets. She didn't run, didn't hurry. Just walked with the steady certainty of someone who'd done this before, in places where hesitation meant death. The room went silent except for the monitor's incessant beeping. Madison stopped 6 feet from the gurney. Atlas's muscles were coiled ready. His eyes were fixed on hers. She could see the war in him, between training and instinct, between protecting his handler and trusting another human. She knew that war, lived it every day. Her voice, when it came out, was different. Not the quiet, deferential tone of a new nurse trying to fit in. This was the voice she'd used in places where orders needed to be followed immediately or people died. Command voice, the kind that expected obedience. Atlas, she said, clear and firm and calm. Guardian down, stand watch. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then Atlas sat, immediately, completely. Like a switch had been flipped. The growling stopped. His body relaxed, fractionally moving from attack ready to watchful guardian. The silence in the trauma bay was absolute. Staff Sergeant Bishop's mouth had fallen open. What the how did you? Madison didn't answer. Her hand hovered near Atlas's collar, not touching, but establishing presence. Her eyes were on the general on the monitor, on the blood that was seeping through his uniform. Move him to Trauma 1, she said, still in that command voice that didn't belong in a civilian hospital. Now. Dr. Brennan stared at her like she'd never seen her before. Then training kicked in. Trauma 1, I need massive transfusion protocol, 2 large bore IVs. Someone get me a fast exam set up. The team mobilized. The gurney started rolling. Atlas rose smoothly to follow his eyes, never leaving General Blackwood's face. Madison walked beside them, her hand still hovering near the dog's collar, creating an invisible leash of trust and authority. Bishop fell into step beside her, his eyes never leaving her face. That command, Quinn, he said quietly, his voice tight with controlled intensity. That's unit-specific. Classified. You don't learn that from YouTube. Madison kept her eyes forward. On the general, on the monitor, on the moment that was unfolding. Not now. Ma'am, you need to tell me where you learned that. I said not now. Bishop heard something in her voice, something that made him pause. Recognition, maybe. The sound of someone who'd given orders under fire, who'd made decisions when lives hung in the balance, who knew what it meant to carry the weight of other people's survival. He didn't push, just walked beside her in silence, filing away questions for later. Trauma 1 was controlled chaos. Transfer on 3, Doctor, Brennan commanded. 1, 2, 3. General Blackwood was moved from the gurney to the trauma bed. A combat medic who'd been maintaining pressure on the abdominal wound continued without pause, his hands slick with blood. Pressure 58/30, Trish called out, her eyes on the monitor. Pulse 145, oxygen saturation 76. Start 2 units O negative, Dr. Brennan said, her hands already cutting away the general's uniform. Begin vasopressors. I want a fast exam yesterday. Scissors flashed, fabric tore. The general's torso was revealed, a landscape of violence. Bruising that didn't match the visible wounds. Puncture marks on the right side where shrapnel had entered. A pressure dressing over the abdomen already soaking through. Madison stood at the periphery, one hand near Atlas, who'd positioned himself at the foot of the bed. But her eyes were working, scanning, processing information with the kind of clinical detachment that came from seeing too many bodies broken in too many ways. She watched the general's chest rise and fall, unevenly. The right side moved normally. The left side lagged, like something was stopping it from expanding fully. Her eyes shifted to the monitor. Oxygen saturation 76, 74, 78, 75. Climbing and dropping, not stabilizing. The pattern was wrong. She looked at the wounds again. Shrapnel entry on the right side. Blast pattern, suggesting the explosion had come from the right. But the general was guarding his left lower ribs, his body instinctively protecting something that wasn't immediately visible. And that oxygen pattern. Fast exam is positive for free fluid, the ultrasound tech called out. Looks like significant intra-abdominal bleeding. Prep for OR, Dr. Brennan said immediately. Get surgery on the line. He needs damage control laparotomy now. Doctor, Madison said quietly. Dr. Brennan didn't look up. Not now, Thornton. We're taking him to surgery. Madison watched the left chest again. Watched the oxygen number drop. Watched the general's body fighting against something they weren't seeing. Doctor, she said again, louder, firmer. Dr. Brennan turned irritation clear on her face. Thornton, we don't have time. His left chest, Madison interrupted. Something's wrong. The room paused. Everyone turned to look at her. The wounds are on the right side, Dr. Brennan said, her tone suggesting this was obvious. I know. Madison stepped closer to the bed, her eyes never leaving the general's chest. But his oxygen saturation is dropping in a pattern that doesn't match just hemorrhage. Watch it climbs when you bag him, then falls faster than it should. He's guarding his left lower ribs. And his trachea, she leaned closer, looking at the general's neck, is shifted slightly to the right. A young resident scoffed, That's a pretty big assumption. Madison cut him off with a look that could have stripped paint. I'm not assuming, I'm observing. His chest is rising unevenly, left side is lagging. The oxygen pattern fits progressive pressure, building in the pleural space. You're about to send him to the OR with an undiagnosed tension pneumothorax. Dr. Brennan's eyes narrowed. How do you, please, Madison said, and for the first time there was something raw in her voice. Desperation, certainty. Check his left chest, ultrasound, now, because if I'm right and you don't, he'll arrest on the table. Dr. Brennan stared at her for 3 long seconds. Then she grabbed the ultrasound probe. If you're wrong, Dr. Brennan said quietly, we're wasting time he doesn't have. I'm not wrong. The probe moved across the general's left chest. The image on the screen shifted gray and black shapes, resolving into something Dr. Brennan recognized immediately. Oh my God, she breathed. On the screen, clear as a confession, was the telltale sign, a dark space where lungs should be sliding against chest wall. Trapped air, pressure building, lung collapsed. Tension pneumothorax, Dr. Brennan said. Left side, how did you? She stopped herself. Never mind, get me a 14-gauge needle, now. Trish was already moving, pulling supplies from drawers with practiced efficiency. The young resident, who'd scoffed earlier, stood frozen, his face pale. Dr. Brennan marked the spot on the general's chest, second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. She inserted the needle with steady hands. The sound of escaping air was immediate and unmistakable. a hiss that meant pressure releasing lung-expanding body getting the oxygen it desperately needed. The monitor responded. Oxygen saturation 75, 79, 83, 88. Heart rate began to slow. Blood pressure ticked upward. Color started returning to the general's face. Better, Trish said, relief clear in her voice. Pressure 68 over 38, rising. Dr. Brennan stepped back, stripped off her gloves. She looked at Madison with an expression that mixed respect and confusion, and something that might have been fear. You just saved his life, Doctor, Brennan said. Madison didn't answer. She was staring at the general's chest, watching it rise and fall more evenly, now feeling the familiar cocktail of adrenaline and relief and exhaustion that came after pulling someone back from the edge. Before anyone could ask more questions, Bishop stepped forward. Ma'am, he said, and his voice had the formal quality of someone making an official inquiry. That command you used, that assessment you just made, I need to know where you learned those things. Every eye in the trauma bay turned to Madison. Trish was watching her with growing understanding, pieces clicking into place. Dr. Brennan was looking at her like she'd revealed herself to be someone else entirely. The residents were staring with expressions ranging from shock to embarrassment, and Madison felt the last of her carefully constructed invisibility crumbling like sand. She met Bishop's eyes, saw the recognition there. The understanding between people who'd been in places where the rules were different and the stakes were absolute. I served, she said quietly, where Navy, hospital corpsman. Deployed. Her jaw tightened. Yes. Where the question hung in the air. She could feel Doc Sullivan's words echoing in her memory. When the moment comes, don't hesitate. Middle East, Madison said. Forward operating bases. Places where the protocol was staying alive long enough to keep other people alive. Bishop nodded slowly. What unit? I can't discuss that. Ma'am, that command is specific to... I know what it's specific to, Madison said, and there was steel in her voice now. And I know you need answers, but right now that general needs a chest tube and surgery, and that's more important than my service record. Dr. Brennan stepped in, her voice carrying authority. She's right. We need to move. Chest tube tray prep for transport to OR. But she was looking at Madison differently now. They all were. The invisible nurse had become visible in the worst possible way. Atlas, still at the foot of the bed, made a soft sound. Madison's hand dropped to his head, the first time she'd actually touched him. The dog leaned into her palm, recognition in his eyes. He knew her, not her specifically, but her type. Had known hundreds of people like her, people who smelled like competence and calm under pressure, and the particular kind of quiet strength that came from walking through fire and carrying others with you. Madison stood there, her hand on the dog's head, feeling the weight of every eye in the room. 7 days of hiding gone in 7 seconds of truth. And somewhere in the back of her mind, she could hear Doc Sullivan's voice, "You're a corpsman." That doesn't wash off. The moment had come. She hadn't hesitated. And now there was no going back. 12 hours later, Madison sat in her car in the employee parking lot watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades that reminded her of warning signals. Her phone showed 17 missed calls. 6 from the hospital administration, 3 from security, 8 from a number she didn't recognize but suspected was military. She hadn't answered any of them. Inside the hospital, General Blackwood was alive, in recovery, stable. The chest tube was functioning. The abdominal bleeding had been controlled in surgery. He would live, because she'd seen what others had missed, because she'd done what she'd been trained to do, because when the moment came, she hadn't hesitated. But the cost of that moment was everything she'd built in 7 days. The invisible nurse was gone. Madison Thornton, civilian trying to start over, trying to be normal, she was gone too. What remained was the truth she'd been running from. She was a corpsman. She'd served in places that left scars you couldn't see. She'd done things that didn't fit on a resume, learned skills that made people nervous, carried weight that couldn't be put down just because you wanted to. And now everyone knew. Her phone buzzed again. Another call from administration. She let it ring. The sun continued to rise, indifferent to human complications. Somewhere in the hospital, Atlas was probably sleeping at the foot of General Blackwood's bed, still on guard. Somewhere Trish was probably starting her shift, wondering where Madison had gone. Somewhere Dr. Brennan was probably filing a report that would raise questions Madison didn't want to answer. And somewhere buried in the files at Seaside Regional Hospital was an application from a nurse who claimed to be nobody special. That nurse didn't exist anymore. Madison wasn't sure who existed in her place, but she knew one thing: she couldn't run anymore. The hiding was over. What came next would have to be faced head-on. She started her car, pulled out of the parking lot, and drove into the morning light carrying the weight of truth like she'd once carried a rifle and a medical kit. Some burdens you couldn't put down. Some battles followed you home. Some things didn't wash off no matter how hard you scrubbed. She was a corpsman. And that was going to have to be enough. The sun was already high when Madison woke in her apartment, disoriented by the fact that she'd slept at all. Her phone showed 11 missed calls and a text message from Trish that simply read, "Call me." Now, she sat on the edge of her bed, still wearing the scrubs from last night, and stared at her hands. They weren't shaking anymore. That was something. But the events of this previous 12 hours played on loop in her mind like a training video she couldn't pause. The command she'd given Atlas. The way every eye in that trauma bay had turned toward her. The look on Staff Sergeant Bishop's face when he'd recognized what she was. The careful way Dr. Brennan had watched her diagnose something that should have killed General Blackwood. Her phone rang, hospital administration. She let it go to voicemail. It rang again immediately, same number. On the third call, she answered. Jennifer from HR spoke with the kind of careful professionalism that meant lawyers had been consulted. "Ms. Thornton, we need you to come in for a meeting at 2 o'clock today. Conference room 314. It's regarding the incident last night." "Am I being terminated?" A pause. "That will be discussed during the meeting. Please don't be late." The line went dead. Madison showered, letting water hot enough to hurt run over skin that felt too sensitive, like her body was rejecting the pretense of normalcy. She dressed in civilian clothes, jeans, and a plain shirt because wearing scrubs to your own execution felt wrong. The drive to the hospital took 12 minutes. She spent them not thinking about anything, keeping her mind deliberately blank the way she'd learned to do before missions when thinking too much could paralyze you. The conference room smelled like coffee someone had made hours ago, and air conditioning that was working too hard. 3 people sat waiting for her. Victoria Brennan, the CEO, had the look of someone who'd spent the morning in emergency meetings. Her suit was impeccable, but her eyes were tired. Marcus Dalton, security chief, sat with a folder in front of him that was thicker than it should have been. He didn't look at Madison when she entered. That told her everything she needed to know about how this was going to go. Jennifer from HR had positioned herself as the neutral party, but her sympathetic expression suggested she already knew the outcome and didn't like it. "Ms. Thornton, please sit," Victoria said. Madison sat, didn't cross her arms, didn't fidget, just sat with the stillness of someone who'd learned that control started with your body and worked inward. Victoria opened a folder. "Last night you used what appears to be classified military protocols to control a tactical working dog. You then influenced a critical medical decision that, while ultimately correct, contradicted the attending physician's initial assessment. Can you explain why you felt it necessary to save a man's life?" Madison's voice was quiet but had edges. "That's why I became a nurse. To save lives. That's what I did." "That's not what's being questioned," Marcus interjected. "What's being questioned is your background, your training, the fact that you have knowledge and skills that weren't disclosed during the hiring process. I disclosed everything legally required, but not everything relevant." Victoria's tone wasn't hostile, just firm. "We ran a deeper background check this morning. Your military service record was extensive. Hospital corpsman, 4 years active duty attached to Marine units and forward operating bases. 2 deployments to classified locations, multiple commendations, an honorable discharge 3 years ago after an incident that's redacted in your file." The room went silent. Madison felt the weight of things she'd tried to bury pressing down on her chest. "The incident was medical," she said finally. "Not disciplinary. I was injured during a mortar attack on an aid station. Spent 6 months in recovery. The Marines offered me a position stateside, but I chose to separate. That's all." "That's not all," Marcus said, sliding a paper across the table. "We also found that you're currently registered with the VA for ongoing PTSD treatment, that you've been prescribed medications for anxiety and sleep disorders, that you have documented episodes of what?" Madison's voice was hard now. "Of surviving things that would break most people, of learning to function despite trauma, of being exactly the kind of person you want in an emergency because I don't panic when everything goes to hell." Jennifer shifted uncomfortably. "Ms. Thornton, no one is saying you're not competent." "Then what are you saying?" Victoria took control back. "We're saying that we have concerns about disclosure, about potential security risks, about whether your military background might create situations that put the hospital at risk." "The hospital wasn't at risk last night. A patient was dying and I saved him." "You also created a security incident," Marcus said. 4 armed Marines in my emergency department. A military working dog that nearly attacked hospital staff. Federal agents arriving at 3 in the morning. Media calling for statements about what happened. This isn't just about medical care, Ms. Thornton. It's about institutional liability. Madison understood now. This wasn't about her competence. It was about fear. Fear of lawsuits, of bad publicity, of things that couldn't be controlled or predicted or managed by policy. So you're firing me because I'm too good at my job. We're placing you on administrative leave, Victoria clarified, pending a full review of your credentials and background. Standard procedure when questions arise about an employee's mental health, Madison finished. You can say it. You think veterans are unstable, that PTSD makes us dangerous, that military training is a liability in civilian settings. That's not what we're saying. Then what are you saying? Victoria met her eyes. We're saying we need time to assess the situation, to understand what happened last night, to determine if there are security implications we need to address. You'll be on paid leave for 72 hours while we conduct the review. After that, we'll make a determination about your continued employment. Madison stood slowly. And if I refuse, then we'll have to consider termination for cause, failure to cooperate with an administrative investigation. The room felt smaller suddenly. Madison had survived firefights and mortar attacks and watching friends die in her arms. But this being reduced to a risk assessment, a liability, a problem to be managed, this felt like a different kind of violence. I understand, she said quietly. We're not trying to punish you, Jennifer said, and she sounded like she meant it. We just need clarity. Madison walked to the door, hand on the handle, then turned back. General Blackwood is alive because I saw what your emergency physician missed, because I have training that doesn't come from textbooks, because I've worked in conditions where missing attention pneumothorax meant signing someone's death certificate. She paused. You can put me on leave, you can review my file, but you can't change the fact that when it mattered, I was the most qualified person in that room. And you know what the saddest part is? If you'd known about my service record, when you hired me, you probably would have passed. You would have chosen someone less qualified because they made you more comfortable. She left before anyone could respond. The hallway was empty except for Dr. Alexandra Brennan, who was leaning against the wall with 2 cups of coffee and an expression that suggested she'd been waiting. They suspended you, Dr. Brennan said. Not a question. Administrative leave. 72 hours. That's corporate for we're scared of you. Dr. Brennan handed her one of the coffees. For what it's worth, I filed a report that stated clearly you made the correct clinical call, that your assessment was accurate and your actions were appropriate, that without your intervention we would have sent a patient to surgery with an undiagnosed tension pneumothorax, which would have resulted in a sentinel event and probably a lawsuit. Then why am I on leave? Because you're competent in ways that make people uncomfortable. You have skills they can't quantify or control. You made experienced staff look inadequate, and institutions don't handle that well. Doctor. Brennan started walking and Madison fell into step beside her. Come with me. Someone wants to meet you. They took the elevator to the ICU. The floor was quieter than the emergency department, but no less intense. Machines beeped their steady rhythms. Nurses moved between rooms with practiced efficiency. 2 Marines in dress uniforms stood outside a private room at the end of the hall. Staff Sergeant Bishop was one of them. He straightened when he saw Madison. Ma'am, he said. Sergeant? The general asked to see you, and Bishop's expression was carefully neutral. Doctor cleared him for short visits. 15 minutes. Dr. Brennan nodded. I'll wait out here. Madison stepped inside. The room smelled like every ICU she'd ever been in, antiseptic and filtered air, and the faint medicinal scent of IV antibiotics. General Nathaniel Blackwood lay in the hospital bed connected to monitors and lines, a chest tube snaking from his left side to a collection chamber that bubbled softly with each breath. He looked older than he had on the gurney. Pain and surgery did that, stripped away authority and left the human underneath. But his eyes were sharp when they found her alert and assessing. Corman, he said. His voice was rough, damaged by the endotracheal tube that had kept him breathing during surgery. Sir. Madison stood at a respectful distance, her posture unconsciously military. Bishop tells me they put you on leave. Yes, sir. Administrative review. Bureaucratic cowardice. Blackwood shifted slightly, wincing. You saved my life twice. Once by getting Atlas to stand down. Once by catching what their emergency physician missed. And they reward you with suspension. It's standard procedure when questions arise about whether someone who's seen combat can be trusted in polite society. Blackwood's voice was bitter. I've seen that movie before. Good people pushed out because they make others uncomfortable. Skills wasted because institutions are more afraid of liability than grateful for competence. Madison didn't respond, just stood there letting him talk. Do you know why I was on Highway 17 2 nights ago? No, sir. I was traveling to a classified meeting in D.C. Someone leaked my route, placed an IED in exactly the right location timed perfectly for my convoy's speed. If Atlas hadn't sensed something wrong and forced my driver to slow down, the blast would have been centered on my vehicle. I'd be dead instead of injured. The implication hung in the air like smoke. Madison felt her tactical mind engaging processing threat assessments she'd tried to leave behind. Sir, why are you telling me this? Because someone wants me dead, someone with access to classified movement schedules, someone with the resources to plan a sophisticated assassination attempt on American soil. He paused, his eyes intense. And because Bishop says Atlas trusts you, that dog has been trained to detect threats to discriminate between safe and dangerous. He doesn't make mistakes. He sat down for you like he'd known you his whole life. I used the correct protocol, sir. Protocols can be learned. Trust is different. Atlas has worked with hundreds of people, handlers, medics, security personnel. He doesn't trust easily. Blackwood leaned forward, fractionally ignoring the way monitors protested. I'm being transferred to Walter Reed in 36 hours. During that time, I'm vulnerable. Someone tried to kill me once and failed. They may try again. Hospital security is adequate for normal threats, but whoever planned that IED is not a normal threat. Madison's pulse quickened. Sir, I'm on administrative leave. I'm not in a position to. I spoke with Colonel Michael Hayes at JSOC this morning. He's arranging a federal consulting contract, medical advisor for high-value patient care. The hospital will receive it as a formal request this afternoon. They won't refuse federal funding, and the contract requires them to reinstate your access immediately. You're asking me to be your security. I'm asking you to be my medical protection. Someone who can be in this room providing legitimate care while also recognizing threats that hospital staff wouldn't see. Someone who thinks tactically. Someone who's worked in hostile environments where every visitor could be an enemy. Madison felt the familiar pull, the call to duty that she'd tried to silence. Sir, I'm not qualified for personal protection. I'm a medic, not. You're exactly what I need. Medical training, plus tactical awareness, plus the ability to recognize patterns that don't fit. His voice was firm despite exhaustion. I'm not asking you to be a bodyguard. I have Marines for that. But I need someone medical who understands operational security, who can be in this room monitoring my care while also watching for threats that look like normal hospital activity. The door opened. A nurse entered to check vitals, adjusted IV rates, and left. The interruption gave Madison time to think. When they were alone again, Blackwood spoke more quietly. The people who want me dead have resources, intelligence, access to systems that should be secure. Hospital security chief ran a basic threat assessment and found nothing because he's looking for obvious dangers, armed intruders, suspicious packages. He's not looking for a nurse who adds the wrong medication to an IV, a visitor who shouldn't be on the floor, a pattern of movement that suggests reconnaissance. You think they'll try again here? I think they'd be fools not to. I'm isolated, injured, vulnerable. If they can get to me in a civilian hospital, it's cleaner than another IED. Looks like complications from surgery. No investigation, no questions. He held her gaze. I need someone who sees what others miss, who acts before threats materialize, who understands that in this environment, a clipboard and a visitor badge can be as dangerous as a weapon. Madison looked at the monitors, the IV lines, the chest tube keeping his lung inflated, looked at a man who'd survived an assassination attempt and was asking her to stand between him and the next one. She thought about Doc Sullivan's words. When the moment comes, don't hesitate. 36 hours, she said. That's all. After that, you're Walter Reed's responsibility. 36 hours is all I need. Once I'm in military custody with full security, the window closes. But right now in this hospital, I'm exposed. He settled back against his pillows. Colonel Hayes will send the contract details within the hour. Hospital administration will contact you with reinstatement. Bishop will brief you on security protocols. What about the people who leaked your route? Have they been identified? Blackwood's expression darkened. Not yet. FBI is investigating, but whoever it is has high-level access and knows how to cover their tracks. Until we identify the mole, I have to assume anyone could be compromised. That's why I need someone outside the system. Someone they wouldn't know about. Someone they couldn't have planned for. Madison moved toward the door, then paused. Sir, if I'm doing this, I need full access. Security footage, staff schedules, visitor logs, real-time monitoring, no restrictions. Already arranged. Bishop will set you up. And Atlas stays with me. If he can detect threats, I want him as early warning. A small smile touched Blackwood's lips. He won't leave my side anyway. Consider him part of your team. In the hallway, Bishop was waiting with a tablet and an expression that suggested he'd already been briefed on everything discussed inside. The general trusts you, Bishop said without preamble. That's rare. He doesn't trust easily. So I've heard. The IED was sophisticated. Military-grade explosives, remote detonation, perfect placement. Whoever said it knew exactly what they were doing. They also knew the general's route timing and vehicle specifications. That's not amateur hour. That's professional with insider knowledge. Federal investigators, all over it. But they're treating this as foreign terrorism or extremist action. They're not looking at insider threats, people with access and motivation. Bishop's eyes were hard. I think someone at the military or defense community wants the general silenced. Someone who knows he's testifying before Congress next month about contract fraud. Someone with enough resources to plan a sophisticated assassination. What's he testifying about? Can't discuss operational details. But let's say if his testimony goes forward, a lot of powerful people lose their careers and freedom. Billions of dollars in fraudulent contracts. Kickbacks. Equipment that was paid for but never delivered. Marines going into combat with substandard gear while contractors got rich. Bishop's jaw tightened. People worth that much money don't accept failure easily. Madison absorbed this. The stakes were higher than she'd realized. This wasn't just about protecting one man. It was about protecting testimony that could expose systemic corruption. Walk with me, Bishop said. They took the stairs down to the basement level, where hospital security maintained their operations center. The room was smaller than Madison expected, with monitors showing camera feeds from throughout the building, and a duty officer who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Bishop introduced her to the officer, then pulled up building schematics on a computer. You'll have access to all security systems, cameras, badge readers, visitor logs. You can monitor from here or from a tablet I'll provide. Your credentials are being updated now to give you administrative access. Madison studied the camera feeds, dozens of angles covering hallways, entrances, parking areas. But she also saw the blind spots, areas where cameras didn't overlap, corridors that were poorly covered, the kind of vulnerabilities that someone planning an infiltration would exploit. Has anyone reviewed security footage from the last 48 hours looking for pattern reconnaissance? Bishop's expression shifted to respect. Not yet. Hospital security doesn't think that way. They're reactive, not proactive. Then that's where we start. Someone planning a second attempt would scout first. Look for the general's location, guard patterns, shift changes. They'd want to know when he's most vulnerable. You think they're already here? I think they'd be incompetent not to be. The question is whether we can identify them before they act. For the next hour, Madison and Bishop reviewed security footage looking for anomalies. Visitors who lingered too long. Staff who accessed areas outside their normal duties. Movement patterns that suggested surveillance rather than legitimate business. They found three possibles: a man in maintenance coveralls who'd been on the ICU floor twice in 24 hours despite no work orders. A woman with a visitor badge who'd asked detailed questions about patient locations at the information desk. A medical equipment technician who checked ventilators in rooms that didn't have ventilators. Bishop made notes, cross-referenced names against hospital databases. Two came back clean. The third, the equipment tech, had credentials that checked out, but employment history that was thin. I want eyes on him, Madison said. If he comes back, I want to know immediately. Agreed. Bishop pulled up the man's badge photo. Mid-30s, unremarkable features, the kind of face that blended into crowds. I'll alert my team. Anyone matching this description gets shadowed. Madison's phone buzzed. An email from hospital administration. Subject line: reinstatement in federal consulting contract. She opened it. The contract was extensive, professionally written, and came with a salary that reflected hazard pay. Medical advisor for high-value patient protection. Duration: 72 hours. Federal funding through Department of Defense Emergency Healthcare Provision. At the bottom, Victoria Brennan's digital signature and a note. Please call my office to discuss logistics. They moved fast, Madison said. Federal money has a way of smoothing administrative concerns. Bishop's tone was dry. The hospital was very understanding about national security needs once they saw the funding numbers. Madison called Victoria's office. The CEO answered personally. Ms. Thornton, I've reviewed the federal contract. The hospital is prepared to reinstate you immediately and provide full cooperation with the terms of the agreement. Thank you. I want to be clear, this doesn't resolve the questions raised in this morning's meeting. Once the contract period ends, we'll still need to complete our administrative review. I understand. But for the next 72 hours, you'll have full access and authority as specified in the federal agreement. Security Chief Dalton will coordinate with you on protection protocols. A pause. And Ms. Thornton, keep the general safe. Whatever else is happening, that's what matters. The line went dead. Bishop was watching her. Welcome back, Corman. For 72 hours. 72 hours is enough time for a lot to happen. Let's make sure the right things happen. They returned to the ICU. Madison relieved the nurse who'd been monitoring Blackwood, taking position in a chair that gave her sight lines to both the door and the window. Atlas lay at the foot of the bed, his head on his paws, but eyes open and tracking. For the next 6 hours, Madison watched, monitored vitals, adjusted medications, charted with one hand while her other hand stayed near the tablet showing security feeds. She watched the hallway, the visitor patterns, the shift change at 1900 hours when new nurses and security came on duty. At 2130 hours, she saw him, the equipment technician, same face from the security footage, moving down the ICU hallway with a toolkit and an air of belonging that would fool anyone not specifically watching for him. He passed Blackwood's room once, slow step, eyes cutting toward the Marines at the door. Madison texted Bishop, target on floor. Male equipment tech moving toward your position. Bishop's response was immediate, confirmed visual. Watching. The man continued down the hall, stopped at the nurse's station, asked questions Madison couldn't hear but could read in his body language. Too interested in routine information. Too casual in a way that felt practiced. He made a second pass 15 minutes later. Same slow step, same glance toward the door. On his third pass, he stopped outside a utility closet 20 feet from Blackwood's room, pulled out a badge, swiped it. The door opened. That level of access didn't belong to an equipment tech. Madison was on her feet. She touched Atlas's head, stay, and slipped out of the room. Bishop caught her eye. She made a subtle gesture toward the utility closet. He nodded, understanding. The man emerged from the closet 3 minutes later, empty-handed, moving with the same casual air. But Madison had worked enough covert operations to recognize the signs. He'd placed something. Equipment. Surveillance. Maybe worse. She followed at a distance that wouldn't alert him, letting Bishop track him on cameras while she maintained visual. The man took the stairs, moving down to basement level, exiting into service corridors that hospital visitors never saw. Madison's instincts screamed at her to call security to wait for backup, to do this by the book. But her training overrode civilian caution. She'd followed targets through hostile territory before, knew how to move quietly, how to stay in blind spots, how to track without being detected. The man stopped at a door marked electrical, authorized personnel only, pulled out a key card that definitely didn't belong to a hospital equipment tech, swiped it. The door opened. Madison positioned herself against the wall, close enough to hear, but concealed by the angle. Voices filtered through. 2 people, maybe 3, discussing schedules and access points and timing windows. Planning, not maintenance. She pulled out her phone, started voice recording, sent a priority text to Bishop, basement electrical room. Multiple subjects, unauthorized access, need backup now. The voices stopped. Madison's combat instincts fired a half second before the door slammed open. She stepped back, hand moving instinctively to her waist, where a weapon would have been if she were still in uniform. The equipment tech came out fast, his hand reaching for a radio. Madison didn't think, just moved. Grabbed his wrist, mid-reach, used his momentum against him, drove him into the wall with controlled force. The radio clattered to concrete. He tried to counter, and she realized with cold certainty that he had real training, special operations or intelligence work, the kind of hand-to-hand skills that didn't come from security guard courses. They fought in the narrow corridor. Silent, efficient, both trying for quick submission without making noise that would alert hospital staff. Madison got him into a control hold arm, locked pressure on nerve clusters that made resistance agonizing. She was reaching for his ID badge when 2 more men emerged from the electrical room. Not hospital staff. They moved like operators. Professional, coordinated, invisibly armed under jackets that didn't quite conceal shoulder holsters. Madison released her captive and ran. Behind her, radio chatter, coordinated pursuit, the sound of a civilian hospital transforming into a battleground. She hit the stairwell at full sprint, taking stairs 3 at a time, phone already dialing. Bishop answered instantly, Status, hostiles in building. 3 confirmed. Armed, professional, they're coming for him. Location, heading to ICU ETA 90 seconds. Get the general into lockdown, now. She heard Bishop shouting orders, heard weapons being readied, heard the efficient transformation of bodyguards into tactical defense. Madison burst through the stairwell door onto the ICU floor. Alarms were blaring. Nurses were evacuating patients. Bishop and his Marines had formed a defensive perimeter around Blackwood's room weapons, drawn rules of engagement shifting from polite protection to combat readiness. Inside, Bishop commanded. Madison didn't argue. She went through the door as Bishop secured it behind her. Atlas was on his feet, every muscle tense, a low, continuous growl vibrating through his chest. Blackwood was awake, one hand on the call button, the other reaching under his pillow where Madison had placed a panic alarm connected directly to military security. "They're here," Madison said, breathing hard. "3 that I saw, professional operators. They have facility access codes." Blackwood's face hardened. "How long until they breach?" "Depends on how much they care about witnesses." As if in answer, the lights flickered. Once, twice, then died completely. Emergency lighting kicked in, bathing everything in red that made shadows move like living things. Through the door, Madison heard the distinct sound of suppressed gunfire. Not full automatic, controlled 3-round bursts, professional. Then silence that was somehow worse than noise. Atlas's growl deepened. Madison moved to the supply cart, assessing what she had. Medical equipment, nothing that qualified as weapons in any traditional sense. But she'd learned in places like Kandahar that anything could be a weapon if you were desperate enough and trained to improvise. She grabbed a scalpel from the surgical kit, positioned herself behind where the door would open, and picked up an IV pole with her other hand. Not much, but it would have to be enough. The door handle turned. Madison's heart hammered, but her hands were steady. This was familiar. The moment before contact. The space between preparation and action where training took over and fear became fuel. The door opened. A man stepped through, weapon raised, eyes scanning for targets. Madison swung the IV pole connected with his temple, felt the impact shudder up her arms. He went down hard, weapon clattering. 2 more came through behind him, faster, already adjusting to her position. Atlas launched himself at the first 180 pounds of trained aggression, hitting center mass. They went down together, the man screaming, as Atlas's jaws found his arm, crushing through jacket and flesh with force bred for exactly this kind of work. The second man brought his weapon up, aiming at Atlas. Madison threw the scalpel. Not for center mass, she wasn't trying to kill, just disrupt. The blade buried itself in his shoulder. He flinched, aim spooling around, going high into ceiling tiles. She was on him before he could recover, using techniques from close quarters, combat training, fighting with the controlled aggression that came from knowing hesitation meant death. She got inside his guard, struck nerve clusters, exploited leverage, turned his size against him. He went down. Madison grabbed his weapon, suppressed pistol, military issue, and trained it on the door, expecting more. But the hallway beyond had gone quiet. Then Bishop's voice, clear, stand down. The emergency lights gave way to normal illumination. Madison stood in the center of Blackwood's room, holding a weapon she'd sworn never to hold again, surrounded by 3 unconscious men who'd come to commit murder in a place meant for healing. Atlas sat at her feet, blood on his muzzle, still in guard mode, protecting. Blackwood watched from his hospital bed, his expression unreadable, but his eyes sharp with assessment. "Corman," he said quietly, "you can lower the weapon in now." Madison looked at the gun in her hands, felt the familiar weight, felt muscle memory from training she'd tried to forget, felt the part of herself she'd tried to bury rising up and refusing to be denied anymore. Slowly, she set the pistol on the medical cart, stepped back, pressed her palms flat against her thighs to hide the trembling that had started. Bishop entered with his team weapons ready, sweeping for additional threats. Federal agents poured in behind them, FBI windbreakers and hard expressions. "Status," Bishop demanded. 3 hostiles secured," Madison said, her voice surprisingly steady. 1 injured by Atlas, 2 subdued. No injuries to the general. Bishop looked at her, then at the 3 men on the floor, then back to her. "You did this alone. I had Atlas. 3 professional operators, and you took them with a scalpel and an IV pole." It wasn't a question, just recognition from one combat veteran to another. The FBI agents began securing the scene. Medical staff rushed in to check on Blackwood. Hospital security arrived too late to matter, looking confused and overwhelmed. Madison stood against the wall, watching it all unfold with the detached clarity that came after adrenaline burned out and left only exhaustion in its wake. Her hands had finally stopped shaking. But she knew it wasn't because she'd mastered her fear. It was because for the first time in 3 years, she'd stopped fighting what she was and simply became it. Corpsman, warrior, guardian. The roles she'd tried to leave behind had come roaring back the moment someone needed protecting. And God help her, it had felt like coming home. The federal agents arrived 23 minutes after the attack ended. Madison knew because she'd been watching the clock on the wall counting seconds the way she used to count breaths during firefights, anchoring herself to something measurable while everything else spun into chaos. She sat in a plastic chair in the ICU staff lounge with a blanket someone had draped over her shoulders and a cup of water she hadn't touched. Her hands had finally stopped shaking, but only because she'd folded them together so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Through the window, she could see the hallway transformed into a crime scene. Yellow tape cordoned off General Blackwood's room. FBI agents in windbreakers photographed everything. The 3 men she'd helped subdue were being wheeled out on gurneys, handcuffed to the rails, surrounded by federal marshals who looked like they took their jobs very seriously. Staff Sergeant Bishop stood guard outside the lounge door. He'd tried to talk to her twice, but she'd just shaken her head and he'd understood. Some things needed silence before they needed words. Dr. Alexandra Brennan pushed through the door with the determined energy of someone who'd been trying to get past security for the last 15 minutes. She carried 2 cups of coffee and the expression of someone who'd seen too much in too short a time. "They told me you weren't injured," she said, handing Madison one of the cups. "But that's not the same as being okay." Madison took the coffee. It was too hot, but she wrapped her hands around it anyway, grateful for something to do with them. "I'm fine. You fought off 3 armed men in a hospital room while protecting a patient. That's not fine. That's," Dr. Brennan stopped searching for the right word. "That's extraordinary and probably traumatic. So I'm going to sit here with you until someone official needs to debrief you, and you're going to drink that coffee and maybe tell me what the hell is actually going on. I'm just a nurse who happened to be in the right place. A nurse who fights like special operations and thinks like a tactician." Dr. Brennan sat down in the adjacent chair. "I read your full military file after they put you on leave. Called in a favor at the VA. You were attached to Marine units and forward operating bases. You worked trauma during some of the worst combat operations in the Middle East. You have commendations for actions that are still classified." Madison stared into her coffee. "That was a different life. Was it because from where I'm sitting, it looks like that life followed you home and you've been trying to pretend it doesn't exist? That's what you're supposed to do. Come home, reintegrate, be normal. Get a job that doesn't involve people trying to kill you." Madison's voice was flat exhausted. "Except nobody tells you that normal doesn't fit anymore. That you can't just turn off the part of your brain that scans for threats and plans tactical responses and knows 50 ways to kill someone with medical equipment." Dr. Brennan was quiet for a long moment. "My brother served, Army, 2 tours in Afghanistan. When he came back, he tried to be normal too. Went to college, got a degree, started working at a bank. Made it 18 months before he had a breakdown in the middle of a quarterly meeting because someone dropped a binder and it sounded like gunfire. What happened to him? He's a paramedic now, works trauma transport, says it's the only job where his hypervigilance is an asset instead of a disorder." Dr. Brennan took a sip of her coffee. "He told me once that the worst part wasn't the trauma or the flashbacks. It was people treating him like he was broken when he'd never felt more functional. Like his training and experience were liabilities instead of skills." Madison met her eyes. "Is there a point to this story? The point is that you're not broken. You're adapted to an environment most people can't imagine. And instead of pretending that adaptation doesn't exist, maybe you should be asking how to use it in a way that works for you." Before Madison could respond, the door opened again. Victoria Brennan entered with Marcus Dalton and a woman in a dark suit who carried herself with a particular authority that came from federal credentials and years of not taking anyone's nonsense. "Ms. Thornton," the woman said, extending a hand. "Special Agent Sarah Reeves, FBI. I need to ask you some questions about what happened tonight." Madison stood, letting the blanket fall from her shoulders. "Of course." Agent Reeves gestured to a corner of the lounge that was relatively private. They sat across from each other in chairs that were designed for worried families, not federal interrogations. "Walk me through it," Reeves said, pulling out a tablet. "From the moment you identified the threat." Madison recounted everything. The man in scrubs making too many passes. The movement pattern that felt wrong, following him to the basement. The electrical room, the confrontation, the pursuit, the attack in Blackwood's room. She kept her voice steady and factual, reporting details the way she'd been trained to give debriefings. Time, location, description, action, outcome. No emotion, just data. Reeves typed rapidly, occasionally asking clarifying questions. You said they had facility access cards. That level of operational planning suggests inside knowledge. Yes, ma'am. And you engaged 3 armed hostiles with no weapon. I had medical equipment and a military working dog. Miss Thornton, you do understand that what you did was incredibly dangerous. You're a civilian. You should have called security and evacuated. Madison met her eyes. By the time security responded, General Blackwood would have been dead. I made a tactical decision based on available resources and time constraints. That's military thinking, not civilian nursing. I'm both, whether that makes people comfortable or not. Reeves studied her for a long moment. The 3 men you helped subdue are all former military contractors, highly trained, well-funded. They had detailed knowledge of hospital security systems, General Blackwood's location, and his medical condition. Someone gave them that information. Someone who wanted the general dead badly enough to plan a sophisticated operation inside a civilian hospital. Do you know why? We have theories. General Blackwood was scheduled to testify before a Senate committee next month about defense contract fraud. His testimony would have exposed a network of corruption involving billions of dollars and several high-ranking officials, people with resources, people with connections, people who don't accept failure well. Madison absorbed this information. They'll try again, which is why General Blackwood is being transferred to Walter Reed tonight instead of tomorrow morning. Faster timeline, less opportunity for a second attempt. Reeves leaned forward slightly. But there's a complication. Someone leaked his transfer schedule once already. We need to move him using personnel we can absolutely trust. People who aren't in any official databases, who don't have predictable patterns, who can think tactically if something goes wrong. Madison saw where this was going. You want me on the transport team. General Blackwood requested you specifically. Said you're the only person outside his immediate security detail that he trusts completely. He also said you're the best combat medic he's ever seen. And given his service record, that's a significant endorsement. I'm on administrative leave. That's been rescinded. Hospital administration signed off on your reinstatement an hour ago, along with a formal apology for any inconvenience. Moe Reeves's expression suggested that inconvenience was a bureaucratic euphemism for treating you like a security risk. You're also being offered a temporary federal consulting contract. Medical advisor for high-risk patient transport. Pays significantly better than hospital wages and comes with federal liability protection. Madison thought about Doc Sullivan's words, about Atlas choosing her, about the general trusting her, when trust was the rarest commodity in a world where people sold information that could get you killed. What's the timeline? Wheels up in 4 hours. We're using a military medical transport. Blackwood will be accompanied by a full Marine security detail, medical staff from Walter Reed, and 1 civilian medical consultant who has combat experience and tactical training. Reeves's eyes were steady. That consultant needs to be someone who can handle both medical emergencies and security threats. Someone who's proven they can keep their head when everything goes sideways. I'm not military anymore. I don't have clearance for... Your clearance was reactivated 2 hours ago. Classified secret, same level you held during your service. Valid for the duration of this operation. Reeves slid a folder across the table. Everything you need is in here. Transport protocols, emergency procedures, threat assessment briefings. You'll have access to weapons if necessary, though we're hoping this transport stays quiet. Madison opened the folder. Inside were documents stamped with classifications she hadn't seen in 3 years. Maps, flight plans, security arrangements, and a photograph of General Blackwood with his wife and 2 adult children, a reminder that this wasn't just a tactical problem, but a human being with a family that wanted him home. Why me? Madison asked quietly. You have special operations medics, people who do this for a living. Because General Blackwood trusts you, and in a situation where we don't know who's compromised, trust is more valuable than credentials. Reeves stood. You have 2 hours to decide. After that, we move forward with or without you. She left Madison sitting alone with a folder full of classified information and a decision that felt like stepping back into a life she'd tried to leave behind. Dr. Brennan appeared at her elbow. You're going to do it. How do you know? Because you're not the kind of person who walks away when someone needs you. It's probably a terrible character flaw, but it's who you are. Dr. Brennan sat down. For what it's worth, I think you should do it. You are wasted here pretending to be just another nurse. You're something more, something we need but don't always appreciate until the worst happens. Madison closed the folder. I spent 3 years trying to be normal, trying to fit into a world where the biggest crisis is a difficult patient or a scheduling conflict. And in 1 week, everything I tried to bury came back. Maybe it came back because it was supposed to. Maybe this is who you're meant to be. A consultant for dangerous transports. Someone who lives on the edge between medical and military. Someone who saves lives in impossible situations. Dr. Brennan stood. The hospital is going to offer you a permanent position when this is over. Not as a floor nurse, as our trauma coordinator with specialty focus on combat-related injuries and veteran care. We need someone who understands both worlds. Someone who can train our staff to think beyond textbooks. Madison looked up at her. You're offering me a job. I'm offering you a purpose that fits who you actually are instead of who you've been pretending to be. But first you need to get the general home safely. After that, we can talk about the future. 2 hours later, Madison stood on the roof of Seaside Regional Hospital as a helicopter descended through the pre-dawn darkness. The rotor wash whipped her hair and made her scrubs snap like flags, and for a moment she was back on a different roof in a different country, watching birds come in to evacuate wounded Marines who might not survive the flight. She pushed the memory down and focused on the present. General Blackwood was being wheeled toward the helicopter on a specialized gurney designed for air transport. He was stable but fragile, connected to portable monitors and IV pumps that would sustain him during the flight. Atlas walked beside the gurney, his vest identifying him as a working dog, his eyes scanning constantly for threats. Bishop and 3 other Marines formed a security perimeter. Agent Reeves and 2 FBI agents provided additional coverage. A Walter Reed medical team waited near the helicopter, ready to take over once they landed. Madison carried a medical kit that weighed 30 pounds and contained everything she'd need if something went catastrophically wrong at 10,000 feet. She'd checked it 3 times, verifying medications and equipment with the kind of obsessive attention that came from knowing that mistakes in the air couldn't be fixed by calling for help. Bishop approached as they loaded the general into the helicopter. You good, Corpsman? Good enough. That's all any of us ever are. He handed her a radio headset. Channel 2 for medical, Channel 3 for security. Don't hesitate to call if you see anything wrong. We're flying NOE most of the way. Nap of the Earth, low altitude, makes it harder to track, but rougher ride. General's stable enough for it, but monitor him close. Will do. And Thornton. Bishop's expression was serious. What you did tonight, keeping the general alive, fighting off those contractors, that was above and beyond. You saved his life twice in 24 hours. Marines don't forget that. Madison nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She climbed into the helicopter and took her position beside the general's stretcher. Atlas settled at the foot, his body braced against the inevitable movement. The Walter Reed team secured equipment. Agent Reeves did a final comms check. General Blackwood's eyes opened as the rotor spun up to speed. He had to shout to be heard over the noise. You came. Yes, sir. I thought you might reconsider. Running off to join a dangerous military transport isn't exactly normal civilian behavior. I think we've established I'm not particularly good at normal, sir. He smiled, then winced as the movement pulled at his incisions. None of us are. That's what makes us useful. The helicopter lifted off smoothly, banking away from the hospital and climbing into the darkness. Through the open door, Madison watched Wilmington drop away, the lights of the hospital, the grid of streets, the shimmer of the ocean in the distance. Everything getting smaller, more distant, like a life she was leaving behind. The flight was supposed to take 90 minutes. Madison spent the first 30 monitoring vitals, adjusting IV rates, making sure the chest tube continued draining properly. The general's numbers stayed stable. Oxygen saturation good, blood pressure acceptable, heart rhythm regular. But 40 minutes in, something changed. Atlas lifted his head. His ears came forward, swiveling toward the cockpit. A low sound in his throat, not quite a growl, but close. Madison touched Bishop's shoulder, pointed at the dog. Bishop nodded, understanding immediately. Atlas didn't react to normal flight operations. If he was alerting, something was wrong. She keyed the security channel. Bishop, Atlas is signaling something. Could be nothing, could be. The helicopter lurched violently to the left. Alarms screamed in the cockpit. The pilot's voice came over the radio, tight with controlled urgency. Missile lock warning, taking evasive action. The world tilted. Equipment strained against restraints. Madison grabbed the stretcher rail, holding the general steady as gravity tried to throw him sideways. Atlas braced his claws, digging into the deck plating. How? Bishop demanded into his radio. How the hell do they have our position? The answer came in the form of a second alarm. Missile launch detected. The pilot threw the helicopter into a dive that made Madison's stomach try to escape through her throat. They dropped like a stone, the altimeter unwinding so fast the numbers blurred. Flares popped from dispensers blooming white-hot in the darkness, decoys trying to draw heat seekers away from the helicopter's engines. The general's blood pressure spiked. Heart rate climbed. Madison fought to keep IV lines in place while simultaneously trying to prevent him from being thrown from the stretcher. "Strap in," the pilot shouted. "We're going down hard, but not from missiles, from evasive maneuvers that pushed the helicopter beyond its design limits." They leveled out barely 50 feet above a forested valley, traveling so fast that trees blurred into streaks of darkness. Madison checked the monitors. The general's oxygen saturation was dropping. The violent movement had displaced the chest tube. Air was building in his pleural space again, collapsing the lung, turning their medical stabilization into an emergency. "I need him level," Madison shouted to the medical team. "Now." They worked together, stabilizing the stretcher, creating a platform that isolated the general from the helicopter's violent movements. Madison repositioned the chest tube, felt resistance, then breakthrough, the hiss of escaping air. Numbers began climbing again. "Missile away," someone shouted. Through the open door, Madison saw the trail of fire arcing toward them, saw it close the distance, saw the helicopter bank so hard that physics screamed in protest. The missile passed within 100 feet, its proximity fuse not quite close enough to detonate. It continued past them and exploded against a hillside, lighting up the night like dawn. "Second missile," the co-pilot called. But the pilot was already moving, dropping them into a ravine so narrow that rotor tips seemed to brush rock walls, flying between trees, using the terrain as cover, making the helicopter do things that shouldn't be possible. The second missile lost tracking, exploded harmlessly 2 miles away. They burst out of the ravine and climbed rapidly, gaining altitude now that the immediate threat had passed. The pilot's voice came over the radio, breathless but professional. "Threat neutralized. Adjusting course. New ETA 40 minutes. Madison's hands were shaking again, but she forced them steady, checked the general's vitals, stabilized the chest tube, verified all medications were still flowing. Atlas pressed against her leg, offering the silent support that combat animals knew how to give. General Blackwood was conscious, his eyes sharp despite the pain and stress. "Report," he said, his voice weak but commanding. "You're stable, sir. Chest tube repositioned. All systems functioning. You're going to be fine." "What about the missiles? Where did they come from?" Bishop answered from across the cabin. "Unknown, but someone knew our flight path, our departure time, our route." His face was grim. "We have a leak at the highest levels. Someone who wants you dead badly enough to authorize surface-to-air missiles on American soil." The implications hung in the air, heavy as smoke. This wasn't just contract killers in a hospital. This was organized, well-funded, with access to military weapons and classified flight plans. This was conspiracy at a level that involved people with power and resources and the willingness to commit acts of war to protect their secrets. Madison felt the weight of it, felt the understanding that this wasn't over, that getting the general to Walter Reed was just the beginning, that the corruption he was prepared to expose ran deep enough that people were willing to murder him in transit. "Sir," she said quietly, "what information do you have that's worth all this?" Blackwood looked at her for a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice carrying the weight of decisions that would reshape careers and destroy powerful people. "Evidence of defense contract fraud going back 15 years. Bribes, kickbacks, falsified reports. Military equipment that was never delivered, services that were never performed, billions of dollars stolen, while Marines went into combat with substandard gear. And at the center of it all, the network of officials who've been covering for each other, burying investigations, eliminating witnesses. How many people are involved? 12 members of Congress, 23 defense contractors, and at least 6 Pentagon officials with enough rank to influence procurement decisions." He paused, breathing through pain. "I have documents, financial records, testimony from whistleblowers, enough to put all of them away for decades, but only if I survive long enough to testify." Madison understood now why the attacks were so aggressive, why they'd risk exposure with hospital infiltration and missile strikes. Blackwood wasn't just a threat to careers or bank accounts. He was a threat to an entire system of corruption that had operated unchecked for over a decade. "They'll try again," she said. "I know. That's why I need people I can trust. People who can't be bought or intimidated. People who understand what's at stake." He looked at her directly. "When we land at Walter Reed, you're going to be offered a position. Federal medical consultant attached to my security detail. It's a real job with real pay, but it's also dangerous. More dangerous than tonight. Because these people won't stop until either they're in prison or I'm dead." Sir, I'm not qualified for him. You're the most qualified person I've met. You have medical training, tactical thinking, and you've proven you can handle the worst. Plus, Atlas likes you, and that dog has better judgment than most people I know. Atlas's tail thumped once against the deck, as if agreeing. Madison looked out the open door at the darkness rushing past. Thought about the life she tried to build in Wilmington. The quiet nursing job, the apartment with its minimal furniture and maximum escape routes, the pretense of normalcy that had never quite fit. Then she thought about what Dr. Brennan had said. Maybe this is who you're meant to be. I'll think about it, sir. Fair enough, but think fast. We land in 30 minutes, and after that, things are going to move quickly. Walter Reed Medical Center appeared below them like a fortress of light in the pre-dawn darkness. The landing pad was surrounded by security Marine guards, federal agents, hospital security, with military discipline. They touched down smooth and fast, and immediately a team of medical personnel swarmed the helicopter. Madison helped transfer the general to a proper gurney, providing report to the Walter Reed medical team with the efficiency of someone who'd done this hundreds of times. Vital signs, medication, timeline, procedure notes, current status. Everything they needed to continue care seamlessly. As they wheeled him toward the hospital entrance, General Blackwood caught her hand. Thank you, Corman. You kept your promise. You kept me alive. Just doing my job, sir. No, you did much more than that. He squeezed her hand once, then released it as the medical team took him inside. Bishop approached with a folder. Your debriefing is scheduled for 0800. After that, you're officially released from the consulting contract. Flight back to Wilmington leaves at 1000 if you want it. And if I don't, then we need to talk about the future, because the general wasn't kidding. He needs people he can trust, and you're on a very short list. Bishop's expression was serious. Fair warning, if you take this job, your life gets complicated. You'll be involved in high-risk operations, federal investigations, threats that most people don't know exist. It's not a career for someone who wants quiet and normal. I think we've established I'm not good at quiet and normal. No, you're good at keeping people alive when everything's trying to kill them. That's a rare skill. We need it. Madison took the folder. Inside was a job offer from the Department of Defense. Medical consultant for high-value protective operations. Salary that reflected danger pay. Benefits that included federal security clearances and hazard insurance. A position that would use everything she'd learned in service and everything she'd tried to forget in civilian life. I need to make some calls, she said. Conference room down the hall. Take your time. Madison found the room and closed the door. Sat in silence for a long moment, feeling the weight of decision pressing down on her shoulders. Then she pulled out her phone and made the first call. Dr. Alexandra Brennan answered on the second ring, sounding exhausted but alert. Please tell me the general made it safely. He made it, had some complications, but he's stable now. And you, Bob, I'm fine, but I need to talk to you about the job offer, the trauma coordinator position. There was a pause. You're not taking it. I don't know yet. That's why I'm calling, to ask what you think I should do. Dr. Brennan was quiet for a moment. I think you should do what makes you feel useful. What makes you feel like yourself instead of like you're pretending to be someone else? If that's working at Seaside, we'd be honored to have you. But if it's something else, something that uses all of who you are instead of just the parts that fit comfortably into civilian medicine, then you should do that. Even if it's dangerous. Especially if it's dangerous. Because the things worth doing usually are. Another pause. You saved a general's life twice, fought off armed attackers, and survived a missile strike. I don't think you're built for quiet nursing stations and scheduled lunch breaks. I think you're built for the edge between order and chaos. And that's okay. The world needs people like you. Madison felt something tight in her chest loosen. Thank you. Come visit when you can. Bring stories. We'll keep your file active in case you change your mind. The second call was harder. Doc Sullivan answered with the gruff warmth of someone who'd been awake for hours but pretended otherwise. Corman, heard you had an exciting night. News travels fast. When the FBI raids a hospital and evacuates a general via helicopter, people notice. When the person involved is a nurse I've been mentoring, I notice especially. His tone shifted, becoming more serious. You okay? Physically, yes. Emotionally, I'm not sure. They're offering me a job. Federal consulting. High-risk medical operations. And you're calling me because you want permission to take it. I'm calling because I don't know if I should. I spent 3 years trying to build a normal life, trying to prove I could be more than just a combat medic, and in 1 week, everything I built fell apart. Did it fall apart, or did it reveal itself to be built on the wrong foundation? Doc's voice was gentle but firm. You can't be someone you're not, kid. I learned that the hard way. Tried to retire, tried to be a regular civilian, tried to pretend my training and experience didn't matter. Made myself miserable for 2 years before I accepted that I'm always going to be a corpsman first and everything else second. How do you live with that? By finding ways to use it that feel right. I volunteer at the VA. I teach young medics. I help people like you figure out where they fit. It's not the same as active service, but it uses who I am instead of hiding it. He paused. If this job feels right, if it uses your skills and gives you purpose, then take it. Stop apologizing for being good at things that scare other people. Madison closed her eyes. I'm tired of fighting what I am. Then stop fighting, start accepting. You're a combat medic with skills that save lives in impossible situations. That's not a curse, it's a gift. Use it. After the call ended, Madison sat in the conference room and looked at the job offer again. Read through the details. The responsibilities, the risks, the promise of doing work that mattered in ways that most people would never understand. She thought about Atlas choosing her, about the general trusting her, about Bishop recognizing her as one of their own, about Dr. Brennan and Doc Sullivan telling her to stop pretending. She thought about 7 days of trying to be invisible, of hiding skills that could save lives, of apologizing for being competent in ways that made people uncomfortable. And she thought about standing in a hospital room with 3 armed men while a general bled behind her, making split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death, feeling more herself in that moment than she had in 3 years of pretending to be normal. The decision wasn't hard. It just took courage to admit what she'd known all along. She was a corpsman. That didn't wash off. And maybe it wasn't supposed to. Madison picked up a pen and signed the contract. 6 months later, Madison stood in the parking lot of Seaside Regional Hospital on a warm spring morning, feeling strangely like she was visiting a place from her past rather than a place she'd only left half a year ago. The hospital looked the same. Same automatic doors, same smell of antiseptic when you walk through them, same busy energy of people trying to heal and be healed. But she was different. That was the part that mattered. She wore civilian clothes, jeans, and a jacket, but underneath was a reality that couldn't be seen. Federal credentials that gave her access to places most people didn't know existed. Training that had been updated and refined. Experience that came from 6 months of working operations that would never appear in news reports or official records. She'd kept General Blackwood alive through 3 more assassination attempts. She'd provided medical support for operations that couldn't use traditional military resources. She'd trained a new generation of combat medics in techniques that bridged civilian and military medicine. She'd found her place, not by pretending to be something she wasn't, but by accepting everything she was. Dr. Brennan met her in the lobby with a hug that surprised them both. You look good. Different, but good. Different how? Like you've stopped apologizing for taking up space. Like you've figured out where you fit. Dr. Brennan gestured toward the elevator. Come on, I want to show you something. They rode to the 3rd floor to a wing of the hospital that Madison didn't recognize. New paint, new signage, a plaque on the wall that made her stop and stare. The Thornton Center for Veteran Medical Care, established with funding from the Department of Defense and the Veterans Administration, providing specialized trauma care and transitional medicine for military personnel and veterans. We broke ground 3 months ago, Dr. Brennan said. Opened in last month. It's fully staffed with nurses and doctors who have military experience or specialized training in combat-related injuries. We've treated 60 patients already, saved lives that would have been lost because civilian doctors didn't understand blast injuries or chemical exposure or the particular hell of wounds that don't show up on x-rays. Madison couldn't speak, just stared at the plaque with her name on it. You inspired this, Dr. Brennan continued. What you did that night, identifying what I missed, saving the general, showing us that military medicine and civilian medicine need to talk to each other. It changed how we think about veteran care. So we built this, in your honor, because you showed us that the skills veterans bring home aren't liabilities. They're exactly what we need. Inside the center, Madison saw familiar faces. Trish Kowalski was training a new nurse on trauma protocols. A young Marine she recognized from her first week was working as a patient advocate, helping other veterans navigate civilian healthcare. And in a small office at the back, Doc Sullivan was teaching a class on combat field medicine to civilian emergency staff. He saw her through the window and grinned, gave her a small salute. She saluted back. Informal, brief, but carrying the weight of recognition between people who understood what service meant. There's one more thing, Dr. Brennan said, leading her to a therapy room at the end of the hall. Inside, a young Marine sat on an exam table while a physical therapist worked on his injured leg. At the foot of the table, lying patiently, was a Belgian Malinois with gentle eyes and a therapy dog vest. Atlas had retired from active duty after General Blackwood's testimony had concluded. Too old for the rigors of tactical work, but still valuable. Still capable of providing comfort and security to people who needed it. The dog's head lifted when Madison entered. His tail began to wag. He remembered. She knelt beside him, running her hands through his fur, feeling him lean into her touch the way he had in that hospital room 6 months ago when everything had changed. He helps veterans with PTSD, the physical therapist explained. Something about working dogs, they understand trauma in ways humans can't. They provide security without judgment, presence without questions. Several patients have told us Atlas is the reason they kept coming to appointments. Madison looked into Atlas's eyes, saw recognition there, understanding, the acknowledgement between survivors who'd been through fire together. "Good boy," she whispered. "You found your purpose too, didn't you?" His tail wagged harder. Madison stood and turned to Dr. Brennan. "This is incredible, all of it. I don't know what to say." "Say you'll come back when you can. Talk to our staff. Share what you're learning. Help us build bridges between the military and civilian medical worlds." Dr. Brennan smiled. "You're doing important work, work that saves lives. But so is this, and you started it by being brave enough to stop hiding who you are." That evening, Madison sat in her car in the hospital parking lot watching the sun set over Wilmington in shades of orange and gold that didn't remind her of warning signals anymore. Her phone buzzed with a message from Bishop. New operation, high-risk protective detail for a witness in the corruption trial. Duration 3 weeks. Interested, she typed back, "Send details. I'm in." Another message came through, this time from the general. "Thank you for everything, Corpsman. The testimony is complete. Indictments are being filed. We're winning. None of it would have been possible without you." She replied, "Just doing my job, sir. Glad you're safe." One more message from her brother, who she'd finally called 2 months ago to explain what she'd been doing with her life. "Proud of you, sis. Mom would have been too. Stay safe out there." Madison set the phone down and looked at her reflection in the rearview mirror. Same face, same eyes. But something fundamental had changed. The exhaustion that had haunted her for 3 years was gone. The constant feeling of being out of place had faded. The shame of having skills that made other people uncomfortable had transformed into pride. She was Madison Thornton, hospital corpsman, combat medic, federal consultant, keeper of the barely alive. Bridge between worlds that needed to understand each other. She was a warrior who'd learned that some battles were fought in hospitals instead of deserts, that some enemies were fought with medicine instead of weapons, that some victories looked like keeping people breathing when everything conspired to stop their hearts. She tried to hide who she was, tried to be smaller, quieter, more acceptable. But the world needed her full-size, needed her loud when lives were at stake, needed her unacceptable skills and uncomfortable competence, and refusal to let people die when she could stop it. She'd stopped apologizing for that, stopped pretending, stopped hiding. And in the space left behind, she'd found something rare and precious. Purpose, pride, peace with who she was. The hidden warrior had stepped into the light, and she had no intention of going back into the shadows. Madison started her car and drove toward the airport, toward the next operation, toward the work that made her feel whole. Atlas had found his purpose in helping wounded warriors heal. Dr. Brennan had found hers in building bridges between military and civilian medicine. Doc Sullivan had found his in teaching the next generation. And Madison had found hers in standing between the darkness and the people who needed protecting, using every skill she'd learned in places that had tried to break her. Some people were built for quiet lives, for safety and predictability and schedules that didn't involve missiles or armed attackers or bleeding generals who needed miracles. Madison wasn't one of those people. She was built for the edge, for the moment when everything went wrong and someone needed to make it right, for the intersection between medicine and combat, where lives hung in the balance and hesitation meant death. She tried to deny it, tried to be something else, but some truths couldn't be denied. Some identities couldn't be shed like old clothes. She was a corpsman, a warrior, a guardian, and that was exactly who she was supposed to be. The plane was waiting, the mission was calling, the work continued. Madison Thornton walked toward it with steady hands and clear eyes, and the absolute certainty that she was finally completely undeniably herself. The hiding was over. The warrior had come home, not to the place she'd left, but to the person she'd always been, and that made all the difference.